Did you know that some of the greatest moments in history began with dreams? But I'm not talking about the dreams you have while sleeping. I'm talking about dreams that change the destiny of empires, entire families, and even the course of history. Can you imagine if you had a dream that could reveal the future of an entire kingdom? Joseph, Pharaoh, and Nebuchadnezzar experienced this. And each of these dreams brought a new meaning to their lives, revealing not only the future, but also the divine plans for the times to come. And the big question is, what do these dreams really mean? How did they impact not only the characters involved, but the entire biblical and historical context? Stay with me for the next few minutes as we will discover how the dreams of Joseph, Pharaoh, and Nebuchadnezzar continue to resonate to this day. You will be surprised by what we can learn from these divine visions. Before we continue, if you want to discover more stories that changed the destiny of great empires, subscribe now and hit the bell to not miss any of these incredible revelations. Joseph was the favorite son of Jacob, a young man full of dreams and ambitions. Born to Rachel, his father's beloved wife, he stood out among his brothers from an early age. However, this prominent position did not make him popular. His brothers, envious of his special treatment, looked at Joseph with contempt and resentment. But Joseph was not aware of the intensity of this rivalry. In his heart, he was convinced that the dreams he had were not just fantasies, they were divine signs. One night, Joseph had a striking dream, a dream that seemed simple but would cause great repercussions in his life. He saw himself in a field with his brothers, binding sheaves of wheat. Suddenly, Joseph's sheaf stood up and remained upright, while the sheaves of the other brothers bowed down before him. Joseph, without hesitation, told the dream to his brothers, not imagining that this would infuriate them even more. "Will you reign over us?" his brothers said, filled with anger. To them, Joseph's dream was not just a vision, but an affront to their pride. This dream represented an ascent that seemed impossible, especially coming from Joseph, the youngest son, and apparently the weakest. But despite his brother's aggressive reaction, Joseph did not understand the gravity of the situation. He believed that this dream was a sign of something great that was to come, something he could not yet fully understand. Joseph had another, even more audacious dream. In this dream, he saw the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowing down before him. This vision was not just a continuation of the first dream, but now Joseph saw his own parents and brothers bowing down to him. When he told this dream, his relationship with his parents also became complicated. Jacob, even being Joseph's father, felt uncomfortable with the idea that his favorite son would be above everyone else. He reprimanded Joseph, but deep down he kept these words and pondered them. What seemed to be just a dream of a young dreamer was beginning to gain unexpected depth. Although his brothers were filled with resentment and jealousy, the truth was that Joseph was being shaped for a purpose greater than he himself could imagine. He did not know, but this dream was foreshadowing not only his personal ascent, but also the salvation of his own family in times of great suffering. But as we know, not all dreams come true easily. The envy and hatred of Joseph's brothers would lead to a series of dramatic events. What seemed to be a dream of victory would soon turn into a series of challenges that would test his faith and perseverance. When Joseph was sold as a slave by his own brothers, he probably thought that his dreams were dead, that the destiny he imagined for himself was now lost forever. But the truth is that dream, like all dreams given by God, had a divine purpose that was just beginning to be revealed. Now, what did Joseph's dreams really mean? They are not just about his destiny, but about a pattern that would repeat itself throughout biblical history. God often chooses the most unlikely to fulfill his purposes. Joseph, the young man despised and rejected, would become a central figure in the preservation of a people, and his dream indicated the beginning of a divine plan that would be fulfilled not only by him, but by his entire family and all of Egypt. Now that we have seen how Joseph's dreams were just the beginning of something much bigger, let's talk about another dream, which, this time, did not involve a young dreamer but the Pharaoh of Egypt himself. How can a dream affect not just one man, but the future of an entire nation? Let's understand the meaning behind Pharaoh's visions and how this surprisingly connects with Joseph's dreams. Prepare to discover how wisdom and divine interpretation can change the history of an empire. But first, have you ever imagined having a dream that changes everything? Joseph had one, and his brothers did not like it at all. But what do you think this dream really meant? Tell me in the comments. Your opinion is very important. While Joseph was living through his journey of trials and challenges, something extraordinary was happening in the palace of Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt. Pharaoh, a powerful man, was troubled by two dreams that he could not understand. These dreams, although disturbing, would be the key to Egypt's future and to the destiny of Joseph, who was still far from home and living as a slave. In the first dream, Pharaoh saw himself by the Nile, where 7 fat and healthy cows were grazing. However, suddenly, 7 thin and sickly cows appeared and devoured the healthy cows. Pharaoh woke up, frightened, and tried to understand the meaning of his vision, but he could not find an answer. He fell asleep again, and the vision repeated itself, now with 7 healthy and full ears of grain being devoured by 7 withered and dry ears. The king, distressed, summoned all the magicians and wise men of Egypt to interpret the dreams, but no one was able to give a convincing explanation. The empire was in panic. These dreams were not just random visions, but messages of an uncertain and potentially devastating future. Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world at the time, felt helpless, unable to understand what the future held for his empire. At this moment, Pharaoh's cupbearer, who had been imprisoned with Joseph years before, remembered the young Hebrew who, in prison, had interpreted his own dreams accurately. He told Pharaoh about Joseph and how he had the divine ability to interpret dreams. Desperate and with no other options, Pharaoh sent for Joseph, who was quickly taken out of prison and brought before the king. When Joseph stood before Pharaoh, he did not waste time in showing that his wisdom came not from himself, but from God. "It is not I," Joseph said to Pharaoh, "but God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." Pharaoh, with great attention, recounted his dreams to Joseph, and then the young Hebrew began to reveal the true meaning of the visions. Joseph explained that the 7 years of fat cows and healthy ears of grain represented 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of severe famine, symbolized by the thin cows and withered ears. Egypt would experience great prosperity, but this abundance would be followed by a devastating crisis. Joseph, with wisdom, suggested that Pharaoh begin to store grain during the years of plenty to prepare for the famine that was to come. This advice, seemingly simple, was interpreted as a divine plan. Pharaoh was impressed with the clarity of the interpretation and Joseph's wisdom. Not only was the king convinced that Joseph was a man of God, but he also recognized that he was the right person to lead Egypt during the approaching years of crisis. Impressed with Joseph's ability, Pharaoh elevated him to the highest position in the empire, making him second in command, responsible for administering all the grain, distribution, and the survival of the country during the imminent crisis. This moment was crucial, as Joseph's wisdom and vision would save not only Egypt, but also other nations, including his own family. Pharaoh's dream, which initially seemed like a disturbing vision of an uncertain future, now became a sign of great change. What seemed like a series of natural disasters would, in fact, be an opportunity for Joseph to fulfill the divine purpose revealed to him years before. Pharaoh, who previously did not understand the meaning of his own dreams, was now being guided by a young Hebrew who, through divine wisdom, could save an entire nation. Pharaoh's dream and its interpretation by Joseph are a clear example of how, in moments of crisis, Answers can come from the most unexpected places. God often chooses the unlikely to accomplish his greatest deeds, as we also saw in Joseph's dream. And in doing so, he transforms what seems to be a destiny of misfortune into a plan that brings salvation to many. Now that we have seen how Pharaoh's dream helped Joseph achieve power and save Egypt, let's move forward in time. And now we will talk about an even more powerful empire. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, also had a dream that would shake the foundations of the known world. This dream, although very different from the previous ones, also carried a profound divine meaning, which would reveal the succession of kingdoms and the future of humanity. Let's understand how this dream impacted the destinies of all the empires. But first, imagine having a dream that threatens to destroy an entire empire. Pharaoh had this terrifying vision, but what seemed to be a nightmare could turn into the salvation of a nation. How? Stay with us, because Joseph's interpretation will surprise you. Don't go anywhere. The kingdom of Babylon was one of the most powerful and advanced civilizations of the ancient world. Nebuchadnezzar II, its king, was a man known for his wisdom, strength, and the magnitude of his conquests. However, even he, who ruled a vast empire, was not immune to the mystery of dreams. One turbulent night, Nebuchadnezzar had a disturbing dream, something that deeply troubled him. Upon awakening, he found himself before a huge statue made of various materials, which seemed about to fall. The statue had a head of gold, a chest and arms of silver, a belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and feet of clay mixed with iron. The vision was enigmatic, and the king knew that this was not just a fantasy, but a message with a purpose. The problem, however, was that Nebuchadnezzar could not understand what the dream meant. The king's distress was so great that he summoned all the wise men, magicians, and astrologers of his court. He challenged them. He needed not only the interpretation of the dream, but also wanted them to tell him the content of the dream without him revealing it. Nebuchadnezzar wanted to be sure that the interpretation came from a divine source, not mere guesswork. When the court's wise men failed to reveal the dream, Nebuchadnezzar became furious. He ordered that all the wise men of the empire be killed. However, the young Daniel, who was still a Jewish prisoner, was among the wise men and had heard of the death order. With wisdom and confidence in God, Daniel presented himself to the king and asked for a little more time to obtain the answer. That night, Daniel prayed to God, seeking the revelation. And God, in his infinite mercy, revealed the dream to Daniel, showing him the great statue and its meanings. What seemed to be a terrifying nightmare for Nebuchadnezzar was actually a glimpse into the future of all the empires that would rule the earth. The next day, Daniel was called into the presence of the king, and with humility declared that it was not he who had the wisdom to interpret the dream, but God. He revealed the content of the vision, describing the statue. The head of gold represented Nebuchadnezzar himself and the Babylonian Empire, an empire of great wealth and power. The chest and arms of silver represented the Medo-Persian Empire, which would succeed Babylon. The belly and thighs of bronze symbolized the Greek Empire, which would arise under the leadership of Alexander the Great. The legs of iron represented the Roman Empire, which would conquer much of the known world, and the feet of clay, mixed with iron, symbolized a final empire that would be strong but divided and fragile, unable to remain united. Daniel explained that in the end times, a stone not cut by human hands would strike the statue on its feet, destroying it completely and establishing an eternal kingdom that would never be destroyed. This kingdom, represented by the stone, was the kingdom of God, which would overcome all human empires and prevail forever. This prophetic vision was of immeasurable importance. King Nebuchadnezzar, upon hearing the interpretation, was deeply impressed. He recognized the greatness of God, who had revealed the future not only to him, but to the whole world. He praised Daniel and elevated him to a position of great honor in Babylon. However, the king was also confronted with the sovereignty of God over all the kingdoms of the earth, making him even more aware of his own limitations. Nebuchadnezzar's dream, unlike the dreams of Pharaoh and Joseph, did not deal with an immediate issue, but with a distant future when the human empire would be replaced by the eternal kingdom of God. The greatness of human powers, represented by the statue, was shown in its glorious rise, but also in its inevitable fall. Nebuchadnezzar was reminded that, although the kingdoms of the earth may be powerful and grand, it is the kingdom of God that will remain, and only He has the final control over the destiny of nations. This dream of Nebuchadnezzar was not just a revelation about the future of his empire, but a profound lesson about divine sovereignty and the fragility of human achievements. Even the greatest kingdoms of the world are fleeting, and only the kingdom of God is eternal. This certainly would have impacted Nebuchadnezzar, who saw his own greatness reflected in the head of gold, but also realized that his empire, like all others, would one day be replaced by something much greater, eternal, and unchanging. Now that we have seen how Nebuchadnezzar's dream revealed the future of world powers, let's go back to the beginning of the story. Let's analyze Joseph's dreams, which not only predicted his own future, but also marked the beginning of a journey that would take him from a simple young Jew to a position of power in Egypt. What lessons can we learn from Joseph's dreams, and how do they intertwine with the events that would happen later? Let's find out. But first, Nebuchadnezzar's dream revealed the future of the kingdoms. But have you ever stopped to think about what this means for our present? Comment here what you think. Are human kingdoms really eternal? Let's talk about it. After being sold as a slave to the Egyptians, Joseph found himself in a foreign land, far from his family and the dreams that once motivated him. What seemed like an irreversible tragedy was actually part of the divine plan for his life. He was purchased by Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, and quickly demonstrated his intelligence and character. His dedication led him to become the administrator of Potiphar's household, and everything prospered under his management. The blessing of God was evident, and Joseph seemed to be on the path to a promising future. However, a new challenge arose. Potiphar's wife began to desire Joseph and tried to seduce him repeatedly. Faithful to God and to his master, he rejected all her advances. "How can I commit such a wicked act and sin against God?" he replied, refusing to betray his integrity. But his faithfulness came at a great cost. Enraged by his rejection, Potiphar's wife falsely accused him of attempted abuse. Potiphar, without questioning, sent Joseph to prison. Even in prison, the presence of God remained with him. In jail, Joseph stood out, gaining the trust of the jailer, who put him in charge of the other prisoners. It was there that he interpreted the dreams of two of Pharaoh's servants, the cupbearer and the baker. He correctly predicted that the cupbearer would be restored to his position, while the baker would be executed. Joseph asked the cupbearer to remember him when he was freed, but he was forgotten. Despite the disappointment, Joseph did not lose faith. Years later, Pharaoh had dreams that no one could interpret. It was then that the cupbearer remembered Joseph and recommended him to the king. Summoned to Pharaoh's presence, Joseph explained that the dreams foretold 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of famine. He suggested that Egypt store supplies for the difficult times. Impressed with his wisdom, Pharaoh elevated Joseph to the position of governor, making him the second most powerful man in Egypt. The young man, who had been sold as a slave, now commanded an entire nation. His dreams of greatness began to be fulfilled in a surprising manner, proving that even in the face of adversity, God had never ceased to guide him. While Joseph's dreams began to materialize slowly, he faced constant trials. But how would he deal with temptation, betrayal, and the ups and downs of life in Egypt? How would his integrity be tested, and how would He continued to trust in God, even when circumstances seemed against him. Let's explore the trials that shaped Joseph for the great role he would come to play. Do you believe that Joseph's dreams were fulfilled in such an impressive way? Comment here. What do you think was the greatest test of faith he had to face? Your opinion is very important. After being sold into slavery to the Egyptians, Joseph found himself in a completely new world, far from his family, homeland, and the dreams that had driven him up to that point. However, what seemed like an endless fall was, in fact, a divine process of preparation. Joseph was purchased by Potiphar, a high-ranking official of Pharaoh, and despite the adversity, his life in Egypt began to show signs that he was destined for something great. Joseph quickly stood out due to his skill and integrity. He began managing Potiphar's household with wisdom, earning his master's trust. The Bible tells us that the Lord was with Joseph, and this became evident in the fact that everything he touched prospered. Potiphar's household was blessed because of his presence, and he soon became the steward of everything his master owned. But while Joseph flourished in Potiphar's house, a new challenge arose. Potiphar's wife began to look at Joseph with different eyes. He was young, handsome, and had an admirable character. She tried to seduce him several times, but Joseph, in his loyalty to God and his master, always refused her advances. He knew that if he gave in to temptation, he would lose not only Potiphar's trust, but also his honor before God. "How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Joseph replied in one of his refusals, showing that his faith was stronger than any fleeting desire. But Potiphar's wife, furious at being rejected, decided to falsely accuse Joseph. She claimed he had tried to assault her, and Potiphar, although hurt and suspicious, ordered Joseph to be imprisoned. Thus, Joseph was thrown into prison, a twist that could have destroyed anyone. However, even in prison, God's hand continued to guide Joseph. In prison, Joseph continued to demonstrate his qualities. He earned the trust of the jailer and became responsible for all the prisoners. The Bible again tells us that the Lord was with Joseph, and this became evident when he interpreted the dreams of two prisoners, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker. Joseph interpreted the dreams accurately, giving the cupbearer a vision of his restoration, to the court and the baker a prediction of his execution. Joseph asked only one thing in return for his services, that the cupbearer remember him when he was released. But the cupbearer, once restored, forgot about Joseph. Joseph could have despaired, but he continued to trust that God had a plan for his life, even when others abandoned him. He remained faithful to his principles, even in moments of great suffering and loneliness. Time passed, but Joseph never lost hope. He knew God had not abandoned him, and his story was far from finished. Meanwhile, in Pharaoh's palace, something was about to happen that would change the course of history. Pharaoh had two disturbing dreams that none of his wise men or magicians could interpret. It was then that the cupbearer, remembering Joseph, suggested Pharaoh call for him. Joseph was taken from prison and, with the wisdom God had given him, interpreted Pharaoh's dreams clearly. Pharaoh had dreamed of 7 fat cows and 7 lean cows devouring them, and of 7 full ears of grain and 7 withered ears consuming the full ones. Joseph explained that the 7 years of fat cows and full ears represented 7 years of abundance, while the 7 years of lean cows and withered ears would be a period of famine that would follow. He suggested that Pharaoh store food during the years of abundance to prepare for the time of scarcity. Impressed by Joseph's wisdom, Pharaoh not only freed him, but also made him the second most powerful man in Egypt, responsible for organizing the food storage. Joseph's rise was swift and remarkable. From slave and prisoner, he became a ruler with authority over all the land of Egypt, and the dreams he had had years earlier began to come true in an unexpected way. Now, with Joseph in a position of power, he began to realize that the famine he had predicted was approaching. When Joseph's brothers, who were living in the land of Canaan, came to Egypt in search of food, the reunion between them was about to occur. But what would happen when Joseph encountered those who had betrayed him and sold him as a slave? Would they recognize him? And how would Joseph react upon discovering that his own brothers were before him, seeking help? Let us explore the emotional and revealing encounter between Joseph and his brothers. But before that, let me ask you, do you think Joseph did the right thing by resisting Potiphar's temptation? Comment below. What do you believe was Joseph's greatest test of character? During his journey, after the 7 years of abundance in Egypt, the 7 years of famine began to affect not only Egypt, but also surrounding lands, including Canaan, the homeland of Joseph and his brothers. The famine spread quickly, and the only hope for survival lay in the food reserves that Joseph, as vizier of Egypt, had organized. It was then that Joseph's brothers, who had caused his suffering years before, decided to go to Egypt to buy grain. Little did they know that they were about to encounter the one whom they had once thrown into a pit and sold as a slave. When Joseph's brothers arrived in Egypt, he was now in a position of authority. They did not recognize him, for Joseph had adopted Egyptian customs and was dressed as a high official of Pharaoh. However, Joseph, upon seeing them, immediately recognized his brothers. He realized that this was the moment he had been waiting for to confront them and test their hearts. In a surprising act, Joseph, who was controlling all the food distribution, decided to act cautiously. He accused them of being spies and had them imprisoned for 3 days. During this time, the brothers began to regret what they had done to Joseph. They began reflecting on what had happened years earlier and the suffering they had caused by selling their brother as a slave. Fear took hold of their hearts, and guilt for their actions weighed heavily upon them. In a conversation between them in prison, they said, "Truly, we are being punished because of our brother, whom we saw in his anguish pleading with us, and we did not listen." After these 3 days of tension, Joseph decided to release them, but not before placing a condition for their return to Egypt with their younger brother Benjamin as proof of their goodwill. He gave them the food they sought and secretly had the money of each placed in their grain sacks, a gesture that would become a major turning point in the story. When the brothers returned to Canaan and explained everything that had happened, their father Jacob grew anxious. He feared losing Benjamin, his most beloved son, and felt that tragedy was repeating itself. But eventually, the brothers returned to Egypt with Benjamin, and the moment of confrontation was near. When Joseph saw his brother Benjamin, he was deeply moved, but he maintained his authoritative facade. After a dinner at his house, where the brothers were treated with great honor, Joseph prepared the moment to reveal his true identity. He had Benjamin placed under accusation of theft, putting all the brothers in a difficult position as before. But Joseph, observing their reaction, saw that something had changed. They were no longer willing to abandon the youngest brother as they had done with him. They were willing to sacrifice themselves to save Benjamin. It was at that moment that Joseph could no longer hide his emotions. He revealed his identity to the brothers, saying, "I am Joseph, the one whom you sold into Egypt." Deep silence filled the room. The brothers, astonished, could not believe what they were hearing. They were terrified because they knew they had wronged him deeply, and now they stood before the man whom they could have killed or caused even more suffering. Joseph, however, did not rebuke them as they expected. Instead, he welcomed them with forgiveness. He said to them, "Do not be afraid. It was not you who sent me here, but God, to preserve our lives." He explained that everything that had happened was not by chance, but part of God's divine plan. Joseph recognized that his rise to power had the purpose of saving many lives, including that of his own family. He forgave his brothers and invited them to live with him in Egypt, where they could escape the famine. The moment of forgiveness was powerful. Joseph not only forgave, but he also acted with generosity. He invited them to live with him in Egypt and provided for them a region rich in resources called Goshen, where they could prosper. Joseph also sent for his father Jacob and all his family, and it was a moment of reconciliation and healing. He embraced them and welcomed them as brothers, showing the power of true forgiveness and God's ability to transform hearts. This encounter was not just a reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers, but also a demonstration of the power of forgiveness, trust in God's plan, and overcoming adversity. Joseph could have sought revenge, but he chose to show mercy. This not only changed the life of his family, but also had a lasting impact on the future of the people of Israel. With Joseph's reconciliation with his brothers and the reunion with his father Jacob, a new phase of the story of Israel begins. The people of Israel settled in Egypt and began to prosper in the land of Goshen. But what would happen when Joseph and his brothers passed away? How would the people of Israel continue to live in Egypt, and how would this influence future events? Let us explore the legacy of Joseph and what the future held for his family and the people of Israel. With Joseph's forgiveness, the reunification with his family, and the promise of prosperity in the land of Goshen, the people of Israel finally found a safe and fertile place to live. During the years of abundance, Joseph and his brothers, now welcoming all of Jacob's children, began living a new reality. Goshen, in Egypt, was the land chosen to be the home of the children of Israel, and there they began to thrive as a nation. However, at the same time, the destiny of the people of Israel began to change. Joseph, now a figure of great influence, governed Egypt with wisdom and grace. His position as vizier, the second highest in the empire, placed him in a position of unprecedented power. He was committed not only to the well-being of Egypt, but also to the safety and prosperity of his own family. He ensured that the people of Israel were well fed and took care of their prosperity in the land of Goshen. However, the years passed, and Joseph grew old. When the time came for his death, he left one last important instruction to his brothers. He knew that Egypt, with its culture and belief systems, might one day become hostile to the people of Israel, and he wanted to ensure that his family would not forget their roots and the promising future that God had prepared for them. Joseph asked that when the people of Israel left Egypt, they take his bones with them, promising that God would deliver them from slavery. This promise from Joseph would become one of the greatest marks in the history of Israel. His legacy was not just about the success of a well-lived life, but about the unshakable faith in the God who had guided his life and the lives of his ancestors. Even amidst the comfort he found in Egypt, Joseph knew that the true promise was in Canaan, the land that God had promised to his descendants. After Joseph's death, the situation in Egypt began to change. A new Pharaoh ascended to the throne, a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph nor recognize the benefits that the people of Israel had brought to Egypt. Over time, the people of Israel began to be viewed with greater suspicion. The prosperity they had once experienced gave way to fear, and the Egyptians began to fear the growing number of Israelites who were now a nation in themselves, ready to challenge the status quo. Oppression began to intensify. The new Pharaoh, fearing the power and size of the people of Israel, had them enslaved, forcing them to work on the great Egyptian constructions. Joseph's dream, which had brought great prosperity to the people of Israel during his life, now became a chapter of suffering for his descendants. The people of Israel, who had once lived in a land of abundance, now faced the bitter reality of slavery. But as Joseph had promised, God did not abandon them. The people of Israel began to cry out for deliverance, and their plea was heard. The story of their liberation, beginning with suffering, would become one of the greatest stories of faith and redemption in the Bible, marked by the leadership of Moses, the great liberator. God's promise to rescue the people of Israel would be fulfilled, and the people of Israel once again would experience the power of a faithful God who never failed his own. As the people of Israel went through hardships and suffering in Egypt, God's hand was working behind the scenes. But what did liberation really mean? What would the path to freedom look like? And what would it imply for the future of the people of Israel? Let's explore the beginning of Israel's redemption journey and how God used key figures to fulfill his promise of deliverance. We will see how, in the end, Joseph's dream of seeing his people free would come true. The people of Israel, now in captivity in Egypt, had suffered under the weight of oppression, but the promise made by God to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was about to be fulfilled. Even after enduring suffering, the children of Israel never lost hope, and this was an expression of the faith that had been planted in past generations. It was in the darkest moment, when exhaustion and pain were palpable, that God began to act in a miraculous way, initiating the greatest liberation in the history of Israel. God raised up Moses, a man destined to lead the Israelites toward freedom. Moses, who was born at a time of great danger, was chosen by God for a divine mission that he himself did not initially understand. He became the messenger of God, the one who would speak to Pharaoh and demand in the name of the God of Israel freedom for his people. Moses' struggle against Pharaoh and the miracles that occurred during the 10 plagues revealed God's power over all things, showing the world that no king or authority could hinder God's will. Each plague that God sent to Egypt was a clear demonstration of his sovereignty. The waters turned to blood, frogs invaded the land, and total darkness covered Egypt. Yet at the same time, the people of Israel were preserved, showing the difference between those who served the true God and the Egyptians who clung to their false gods. Finally, after the 10th plague, Pharaoh relented, and the people of Israel were set free, hastily leaving Egypt on a journey that would lead them to the Promised Land. This liberation was not just a matter of escaping physical captivity, but also of fulfilling the divine purpose. The promise that Joseph made before his death, that his bones would be taken when they reached Canaan, became a powerful symbol that God fulfills all the promises he makes. The people of Israel, led by Moses, moved toward freedom with the certainty that, more than a simple migration, they were being led by God toward the fulfillment of a greater plan. The liberation from Egypt was only the beginning of a journey of faith. The crossing through the desert was long and full of challenges, but it served to shape the character of the people of Israel, who would need to trust completely in God to enter the Promised Land. The crossing of the Red Sea, the daily provision of manna, and the divine guidance by the pillar of cloud during the day and the pillar of fire at night were testimonies of a God who, despite the adversities, never failed to fulfill his promises. Finally, after years of pilgrimage and numerous lessons of faith and trust, the people of Israel entered Canaan, the land that God had promised to Abraham. The journey of liberation was not easy, but it was filled with miracles and demonstrations of the power of a God who never abandons those who trust in him. The legacy of Joseph, the story of his dream interpretations, and the promise that his bones would be taken to the Promised Land were fulfilled, and Israel became a nation under divine protection. The story of Joseph's, Pharaoh's, and Nebuchadnezzar's dreams reveals not only God's sovereignty over the events of the world, but also his faithfulness in fulfilling his promises. Through the dreams and their interpretations, we see how God used challenging situations to bring about a greater good, and how he always had a plan for his people. Joseph, even in his prison, never lost faith and trusted in the promises that God made to him. Pharaoh and Nebuchadnezzar, through their own dreams, had their visions challenged and revealed, showing that nothing happens without God's knowledge. Just as God was faithful in fulfilling the promise made to Joseph, he continues to be faithful today in our lives. We can look at these accounts and see that, even in times of uncertainty, we can trust in God's greater plan for us. He never fails, and his promise of freedom and prosperity for his people extends to all who trust in him. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think God is planning for your life through the dreams and promises He made? Have you seen moments in your life where He acted in a surprising way, just as He did with Joseph, Pharaoh, or Nebuchadnezzar? Share your ideas in the comments below. If you enjoyed this content, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos on biblical stories that can transform your life. And of course, share this video with your friends and family, because God's word should be spread and known by all. See you in the next video, and remember, God never fails to fulfill His promises.